Hi everyone, I'm so excited to bring you this watercolor orchid tutorial, and I hope that you will paint along with me. Because it's such a long one, I thought that I would give some tips and advice before we begin. The first is with regards to my paper choice today. You will see that I'm using Baohong 100% cotton artist's cold pressed paper. This is quite a big sheet. It is a size 410 by 310 millimeter. But the first few attempts that I did of this painting, I did the painting exactly the same size, but the paper was more of an A4 size. It just went a little bit closer to the edges. So if you haven't got such a big sheet, then a sheet of around A4 size will be absolutely sufficient. This is 100% cotton paper, and for this particular tutorial, I wouldn't advise using anything less than 100% cotton paper. Because we do so many layers, 7 in fact, you will find that anything that isn't 100% cotton will start taking strain after a few layers. The paper might become damaged and you won't get the results that you are wanting. Then the brushes I am using today are synthetic round brushes in a few different sizes. Whilst you don't have to have the same brand that I am using, I find that for botanical art like this, having brushes with a very sharp pointed tip are extremely useful for detail work. I think as long as you have about 3 different sizes, a small, medium and slightly larger size, you will have more than enough brushes for this tutorial. I will put links in the description box below to sets of brushes exactly the same as the one that I'm using, as well as ones that are extremely similar. Today I will be using my Daniel Smith set of paints, and I will list in the description box below the colors that I'm using. I'm only going to be using 6 colors today, and you can use the same colors or similar. It's not necessary to have the same colors that I do. I would also like to encourage you not to be discouraged by the length of this video. I'm going to work very slowly and do the whole thing in incrementally small steps so that it is achievable and that you're not under any stress at any time. Also, I would suggest that you practice certain techniques on a different sheet of paper before you start if you are concerned in any way. In fact, I've done this painting 3 times. This was my first attempt just to get my colors the way that I wanted them to, but then I wanted to practice 1 or 2 more things. So in my second attempt, I kept the segments of the painting separate and tried different techniques on different petals. And then only after that did I do it a 3rd time for this tutorial today. We're going to work 1 petal at a time throughout each layer, and I would advise if there is something new that you are doing for the first time and you are concerned about making a mess of something, then I would suggest that you draw templates of some of the petals, just individual petals, on a separate sheet of paper. And if you're trying something new, then try it first on the tester petals before you come and you try it again on the painting. Then you'll come in with more confidence, and I think the whole thing will work out better if you do try new things for the first time somewhere else, especially things like when I do the veins on the petals, because that is quite a technique in which I'm going to work wet on wet, and you might want to try that first on a separate sheet of paper. And I think also keep an eye on layer 1. As I work through layer 1, you will see that I work 1 petal at a time, and I do put quite a lot of water into each petal in that layer. Layer 1 is the most time consuming. It's where we really put the foundation down, and once you've got layer 1 down, the rest is a complete breeze, I would say. So just practice your water control on some tester petals on a separate page, just so that you can be confident with the amount of water that you're putting down, that you've got enough time to put the colors down before the water dries, and also that you're not putting down too much water at the start. And then lastly, if you would like the traceable sketch reference as well as the tutorial pack for this orchid tutorial, you can get that on my Patreon page. The cost of the pack is $4, and for that you will get the free traceable sketch reference as well as scanned images of all 7 layers that we are going to paint today. I think that it is very useful, particularly when painting so many layers, to have an idea of where you are aiming towards on each layer, and that is where the scanned images will come in useful. So for $4, you will get the traceable sketch reference as well as the full pack of scanned images for each layer. And this payment also shows your appreciation back to me for the effort that isn't required to put together a tutorial of this size. So for everyone who supports me, I thank you. I'm going to start with the sketch on the page. I know that the sketch, as you can see it, is very light, and the reason for that is that this is such a delicate painting that I really don't want my pencil lines to show through at the end. So that is why it is very light, but I will explain very clearly as we're going through which section we're working on, and then you'll be able to follow along with me as I do that. For this first layer, I'm going to work in 3 colors, and those colors are Quinacridone Rose, Quinacridone Magenta, and Quinacridone Purple. Now, if you don't have these colors in your palette, I'll give you some tips as to how you could mix them. Even if you've got a limited palette like the Daniel Smith Essential Set, I will link the 2 videos below to the comprehensive videos that I did on this set where we looked at them, swatched them, blended them, and then I did simple 50-50 mixes here, but then I went and did more graded mixes of each color. So in that set, there is just plain Quinacridone Rose, which is the first color that's here. But then let's think about how you could mix the other 2 if you didn't have them. So the Quinacridone Magenta really is the Quinacridone Rose, but just tending more towards the bluer section along here. So if you wanted to mix something like Quinacridone Magenta, you would just start with your Quinacridone Rose and add some French ultramarine to it. And then the Quinacridone Purple, I would say, is either still further along. You've got 2 sections of purples that I think would suffice here, depending on which blue you choose to add to your Quinacridone Rose. If you just continue with the French ultramarine, you would just add more to it and you would get more towards this area here. But I would suggest if you are trying to mix something close to Quinacridone Purple and you have a phthalo blue, then maybe the Quinacridone Rose mixed with some phthalo blue will get you more towards that Quinacridone Purple that we're going to be using in this layer. So I'm going to start with this sort of semi-open smaller bud on the left-hand side up at the top here, and I'm going to work petal by petal, and I'm going to work wet and wet. So I'm going to put water down in this central petal first, but just to explain one thing about this first layer, and actually with regards to this whole painting, is that I'm going to be working very, very light with my pigments. I'm going to water them down considerably and working wet and wet. I think really to try and get the delicate nature of the flower that we're dealing with here, you're really wanting to do very light glazes, and I'd rather come back and do additional layers to get something darker and then have gone in too dark too early, and then there's nothing I can do about that. So my word of caution to you, or my advice would be, however much pigment you think you're going to put down, just put down less, because inevitably, if you're doing it the first time, you will find that you possibly will put too much pigment down too early on. Rather put some down and then come back and do an additional layer if you feel that you need to. So let's take it little bit by little bit. I'm going to fill this central petal here with water. I've still got a bit of pigment on my brush from my mixing. I'm just cleaning that off. Alright, I'm going to work light to dark, so I'm going to get the Quinacridone Rose first. Even the mix that I've got here I feel is too dark. I'm going to take a little bit to the side here, water it down even further, and I'm going to drop that in at the side here, just a little bit here and there. Then the Quinacridone, no, not that one, sorry, the Quin Magenta, I'm also going to water that down. There's a highlighted area here that I'm trying to avoid at the moment. And then the purple. I'll drop in up there. So now I'm going to look carefully at areas that I think I want to leave as highlights. Particularly on the edge here, it is quite light. So I've just cleaned and wiped off my brush. And that will help me to lift some of the color. Here I'm just encouraging a little bit of blending. And I'll just keep lifting. Maybe I'm going to add a little bit more pink just to the right of center here. And I'm just going to keep on with the lifting at the edge. It just helps to exaggerate the curve in the leaf than to have the colors completely flat and the same throughout. So I think I'm going to leave that one at that. So similarly, because I can't work on either side because I don't want the colors to blend from one to the next, let's do, I think what I'm going to do on, no, I'm going to do those later actually. Let's do this one and do the same thing. I'm going to put water down first. I think I actually want a slightly bigger brush to put the water down because it's taking time. This is a bigger size 12 silver black velvet. I've got two containers of water on the side here. One that is the one that I used for my first rinse that the pigment goes into, and then a second one that is clean water so that I am able to put down clean water for my wet and wet layer. So I would suggest always with a painting like this where you're doing wet and wet and you're wanting clean water to always just have a separate container of clean water on the side. At the top here, I'm going to put an end to that there and stop my pigment at that point. I can see there's quite a lot of pooling of water on the top because I've put quite a lot. I'm just going to give it the opportunities to sink in just a little bit. Otherwise, if I drop pigment in, it's going to fill the entire space. So I'm just moving it around and making sure that the water I put down is even, that there's not pooling in any one particular spot or along the edges. Alright, let's start with the Quinacridone Rose first. I'm going to do it in this area here. Add a bit there. There is this lighter area here. Maybe I'll just put a very light pink there, but my darker colors, I'll avoid that area. Onto the Quinacridone Magenta. So this first layer is really not much pressure at all. You've got plenty of time working one petal at a time to get your wet layer down, to drop in your colors, and then just spend some time blending them as I am now, and also lifting the colors in the areas of lightness. Because you're working only one petal at a time, there's no risk of it drying out whilst you are working, and you've got plenty of time to get it right. And if you feel that you've put too much pigment down, you can do some lifting. And always, as I said, just keeping it really light. We're really just mapping in the colors at this stage as to what colors are where on the petal, but we're certainly not trying to do any excessive shadowing or anything like that. What I am going to do is I am going to get the Quinacridone Magenta in a slightly thicker consistency, not too much on my brush, and I'm just going to drop it in where I know that there's the shadow, but I'm definitely going to do more of that in an additional layer. I don't want it to blend too far, but I'm just putting it along the edges here. And then I'm just going a little bit beyond the shadow and just blending it back like that, just pushing it back a little bit. Lifting this area of lightness and then the edge. Alright, I'm going to do the central petal at on the bottom flower now. And the reason why I made the pencil so light was that as soon as you've got even a layer of light watercolor on top, it really hardly erases at all as soon as you've got any color on top. So That is why I'm working with the pencil really light, even just from the start. Alright, the Quinacridone Rose. And then the Quin Magenta. I'm just going to make sure I get these colors right up to the edge here. Now that there's some pigment on the paper, I can see more clearly whether I've got my water to the edge or not. And then I'm going to take that darker Quin Purple. Just a bit on the edges there, but again, it's blooming too far. I'm just going to rinse and dry off my brush. Push that back. That's lifting a lot of my other two colors that I've already put down, so I can just add a bit more of them each. The Quin Rose. And Quin Magenta. That's fine. Alright, let's just do some blending and lifting. I've always got to keep an eye on what it is that I've done so far. Up here I can see the edge is a little bit jagged up at the top here. If I can just smooth the edge a bit there, I will before it dries completely. Here I'm just going to lift a bit there. Alright, let's talk about the buds up at the top here. So if you have a look at the photograph, you can see that there's definitely a little bit of a green undertone that's showing through those buds because they haven't opened yet. I want to do a base color underneath there that we will put the pinks and purples on top of, and that base color will be a greenish color so that it shines through. So I'm going to start with a bit of sap green. Oh, quite a lot there. Let me just put some extra there. But that green on its own is too bright for what it is that I'm dealing with. So I want to just tone it down a little bit. And for that I'm going to use some burnt umber. And that's a much more natural green that we're looking for. So I'm going to put that on, let's say, all four of the buds as a very, very watery base color. And I'm not going to be too concerned about where it is on the bud. I'm going to do, even that's too dark, just adding some water. I'm going to just add it to the whole bud for all four of them. And I think I want to change to a brush that's got a sharper point. This is size 4 as well, but it's very pointed. I think also what I'm going to do before these buds dry completely is I think I'm going to try and lift out some of the highlight areas that are catching the light on them as well. So let me just finish this one and then I'll explain what I mean by that. So on this one there is a white highlighted area in the area that I had sketched off there. So I'm just going to use my brush and try and lift some of the green there. There's also a little highlight here. Down the center of this one. I'm just going to repeat. And then I'll do this bud here in green as well. And there's a bit of a lighter area in this area, so I'm just going to lift that. Okay, when I was practicing this, I put my hand in one of the pink areas and it went on the paper around the side. So I'm quite paranoid now about letting everything dry before I carry on. So I'm just going to leave that a few minutes before I come in and do the next round of petals. I'm going to now start working on the petals adjacent to the central one that I've just done. And an important thing to note about what I'm going to do for these petals is I want to leave a very narrow white gap between the petals at the edge of this one here. It just really separates the petals nicely and makes them pop against each other. When I did my practice for this painting, I initially used masking fluid along the edges here to mask off those white areas. But I find that using masking fluid on cold pressed paper, because of the dips in the paper, the line ended up being wider than I wanted it to be. I wouldn't have the same issue if I was doing it on hot press paper, because that is a lot smoother and you have more control over where the white goes. But for this one, I'm going to try and do it without masking fluid, just because I just felt that the line was too stark. So that means I'm just going to have to proceed more carefully. I'm going to put my water layer down and maybe not go quite as close as I intend on ending. Once I've got my colors in, I might be a little bit braver and push that water closer towards the edge to get the width of the white that I'm looking for. So let's do the first one slowly and carefully, and you'll see what I'm saying. So I'm going to put the water down here and avoiding the very edge on the left-hand side of this petal. So I've left about a 2 millimeter gap there on the edge. Just going to lift a little bit of water. I've put a bit too much down. Alright, starting with the Quinacridone Rose. and then the Quin Magenta. I don't mind having a little bit more pigment down than I did with the first petal, because this one, if you have a look at the reference photo, is in shadow, so will ultimately be a little bit darker. And then the Quinacridone Purple. Alright, so I'm going to lift, blend and push these colors a little bit over to the left. So a little bit too much pigment down there, I'm just lifting it. Alright, so now I'm going to push this color over. I don't really even need a white edge up here where the two petals aren't connected. So I'm going to fill into the edge there and then come out a little bit and start leaving that white. So I'm looking for about a 1 millimeter gap. Great, I'm happy with that. Okay, so keeping with the right hand theme, I'm going to do this petal here. I'm going to put my water down first, and I've got an edge here and an edge here where it's against two petals, so I'm going to aim to leave the white here and in this whole area here. Keeping that in mind as I'm dropping my water in. I'm just going to use that bigger brush to put a blob of water down at the middle. Alright, starting with my Quinacridone Rose. Moving on to my Quinacridone Magenta. And then the Quinacridone Purple. Alright, so these edges I'm going to now push a little bit closer until I've got about a 1 millimeter gap. Having a steady hand and a sharp brush is key. I'm keeping my painting upright for your benefit, but if I wasn't filming, I would probably turn my painting around as I go so that it is always in a comfortable position for me to try and get this sharp edge. Alright, I'm just going to do a little bit of lifting here, and I'm not touching where that area that I'm trying to preserve. I'm just lifting just inside of it. Great. I didn't do this petal up here because it's touching in that zone there, but I can do this petal here because it's not touching that one in any way. I'm just lifting here again. So I'm going to do this left hand petal now. Let me put the water down first. Oh, let me get the big brush. I'm going to go right up to the edge here. And then just leave a little gap there. I'll come and make that a bit more accurate just now. Oh, you see there? I've just put my hand in there. Alright, I'm going to be very careful on this and to not put my hand in there. You can rotate your painting a little bit if you want to make sure that you don't do the same. Being right-handed, I should have thought ahead and done the left-hand one first. Alright, I'm going to pick up the Quinacridone Rose first. If you are enjoying this tutorial, I would appreciate it immensely if you could hit the like button and put a comment in the comment box below. These actions really help build my channel and come at no cost to you. This is the Quin Magenta. And the Quinacridone Purple, I'm just going to put a little bit here and there. Alright, I am going to go up to the edge here, because this goes behind in that area. I'm happy with the fact that it's light here along this edge. Alright, so let's try and do this white edge. So down here, I'm just going to try and leave that millimeter gap. I'm also up to the edge there. For that edge I am going to turn my pad because I just can't turn my hand inside out. And I'm going to try and get that 1mm edge here, blending to the edge outside. Alright, I'm happy with that. I'm just going to keep an eye on it a little bit. Like I'm going to lift along this edge here. The wetter your layer is, the more it's going to blend until it starts to dry. So it's a good idea just to keep your eye on it for a minute or two so that everything stays where you put it. And if not, then push it back. Alright, so this bottom blossom now, I can work on the left one first because there's nothing that's touching the petals above. So I'm going to do the left one and then move to the right. Let me put my water down first. Just in the center. Alright, I'm going to the edge there, but in the areas of overlap down here, I'm not going to the edge. There is no white along this edge at the bottom, so I'm going up to the edge there. Likewise here to the edge, but along this edge here, I'm not going to go all the way to the edge. Alright, let's start with the Quinacridone Rose. And then the Quin Magenta. And a little bit of the Quinacridone Purple. Alright, let's do some blending and sending to the edge. So up here, I'm going right to the edge. Likewise along here. I'm just going to rinse off my brush because I still do want it light along this edge, but I just want the liquid to go all the way to the edge. Alright, now I'm looking for my 1mm gap. I'm just going to do some lifting along this edge. Alright, and let's go and repeat on this side. Two millimeter gap up here to the edge on the right, and then 2 millimeter gap down here and along this edge. To the edge here. Alright, taking my Quinacridone Rose. And then my Quinacridone Magenta. A bit too much water down here. It's still pooling a bit there. Just lifting a bit. And then putting some more Quinacridone Rose down. And Magenta. And my Quinacridone Purple, I'm just going to do in the center here a little. Alright, let's send to the edge. Alright, my 1 millimeter gap over here. Then to the edge. One millimeter down here. Keeping that 1 millimeter. And then to the edge on the outside here. Then I'm just going to do some lifting. Alright, that top flower is dry enough that I can come and do the bottom petal now. This one. So let me put some water in that one. And so for this one, I'm going to leave the white edge over here. This one has got the slightest bit of green showing through, if you have a look at the base of it. Maybe I don't want to mix the green and the purple because it'll just become muddy. So let me actually do a base of the green here. Very, very little, as you can see, very light. And I'm going to let this dry before I come and do a base of the pink on top. That'll just indicate that it's a bud that's kind of between these ones in age. It's still opening, but it's not as big as this, but it's not closed like the ones on the right. That's why it's still got a bit of green in it. Alright, I'm going to let that now dry and then come back and do my base layer of pink on that. But it needs to dry completely before I do that. Right, that's dry now, so let me do the base pink on that. So avoiding that 2mm edge, I'm going to put my water down. Alright, picking up the Quinacridone Rose. And then the Aqua Magenta. And then the Quinacridone Purple, I'm just going to do down on the bottom. Alright, let's do some blending and pushing to the edge. Alright, I'm going to try and push this to my 1mm edge. I just want to lighten up this top edge without going over into the white. Alright, I'm going to work on the two bottom petals of this one here. So here I can see the white edge that I was wanting to preserve at the edge of that petal there and the edge of that petal here. So I'm going to make sure not to go into that area as I'm laying my water down. And I'm also going to, there's a little turn up edge over here. I'm going to avoid that. So this petal, I'm going to put water on this area here, this area here. And then, yeah, that for now. And I'm just wondering, I'm just going to dry that. I think I want to do a white edge on this little piece down here, along here. I want to leave the 1mm edge. So I'm going to go up to the edge of the petal above, up there with my water. But I'm going to leave a little white edge down here. And then up to all of the edges in this piece up here. Bit too much water for such a small space. Alright, I'm going to jump straight to Quinacridone Magenta. I'm not going to do the rose because this piece is in shadow. Alright, let me just drop that in so I can see where I'm at. I'm going to take this up to the white edge there. And then leave my 1mm gap down here. And then up to all the edges here. And I'm going to, because of the shadow there, I'm going to pick up a little bit more Quinacridone Magenta and just drop it in here and down here. Because it's definitely darker on the photo. Right, let's go and do this one now. So I think I'm going to, just looking at the photo, leave out this piece here and then avoiding this white edge here. I'm going to put some water down. It doesn't matter that I've still got a bit of pigment on my brush because this side is so in shadow. It's actually nice to have a bit of a guide as to where my water is down. So I didn't rinse my brush off, I just dipped it straight into the water. Avoiding that millimeter gap of the petal above. Right, so straight into the Quinacridone Magenta, and I'm taking it in a slightly thicker consistency than I did for the top petals, and I'm going to drop it in down here where the color is the most intense, which is closer to this petal above. But keep in mind that the inside over there is going to be the darkest, so I still want to give myself room to go and not go too dark. But definitely where there's a bit of contrast color against the petal above, I'm going to do that. It's lighter over here, so I'm just going to let this blend naturally to there and not take the color all the way. And just lifting a bit along this edge here, so it's not all the same color. Alright, I'm going to move down now and do the same on these two petals down here. I'm going to put the slightest bit of Quinacridone Rose just on the outside, and then pick up my Quin Magenta in a medium consistency and put it here along the shadow edge. I'm just blending it so that it is darker against the petal above. I'm going to take up a little bit more Quinacridone Magenta and just drop that in again here. I'm just trying to neaten up this edge, trying to get that little gap to be as thin as possible but still present. Alright, then I'm just looking at the petal underneath, and then not rinsing my brush. I'm just putting some water on it. I'm going to do this section here. Avoiding that white on the right. I'm going to take it straight down into here. I'm just picking up some of that water there. I can see it's pooling quite a bit. Alright, so again, because it's darker, I'm going to jump straight to the medium consistency Quinacridone Magenta. It really is very dark in here, so I don't mind being brave and dropping it in quite a thick consistency there. And all over in there. Then I'm going to pick up the thicker consistency again, and against the top petal, drop that in there. But I want it to blend to the outside. So I'm just going to rinse off my brush and encourage a bit of blending here, but keeping the outer edge lighter. Great. All right, I'm going to let that dry. Alright, that is completely dry now, and what I'm going to do is there's these little intricate pieces on the inside as well as the stalk. I'm going to do a base layer on, and I'm just going to work from the top down just so that I don't have to keep on doing multiple passes on this. So I'm just going to quickly mix up for myself a little bit more of that sap green burnt umber green mix, just so that I've got little bit more on my palette. And very watery. I just want to get a base just so that everything is mapped out by the end of my first layer. So with a very watery mix of that sap green burnt umber, I'm just going to map out the stalk just so that I can see it, but make it really very, very watery so that we can do light highlights later. Even that's too dark, but I'll water it down as I go and it will dilute what is already there. I'm not skipping out any white edges or anything like that. I'm taking this green right up to the edge of my pencil sketch. It'll just make the whole lot easier to see in the second layer. Leave that white highlight at the edge of that petal there. Now let's look at the center of this one here. We've got some areas that have got the spots on them and other areas that are pink. I'm just going to work with the solely pink one right now. So this little sort of moon wing on this side, I'm going to just put some water in here. This one is also quite dark if you have a look at the photo, with it being darkest down on the bottom right. So I'm going to jump straight to the Quinacridone Magenta in a medium consistency. Drop that in down here. Just wiping that off and encouraging it to blend. I'm just lifting some of the pigment because otherwise it's going to be dark all the way. There we go. All right, let's go and do a similar thing on this side. So the equal to that will be this little piece that's in here. So let's do that. Alright, water down first, then I'm picking up that Quin Magenta. and it's darkest closest to this side. Then let's have a look at this one down at the bottom. I think I will do this wing over here. I'm taking water right up to the edge on all sides. Okay, I'm going to take the Quinacridone Rose first because it is a bit lighter up at the top, and put that down. I don't know what's going on there. Putting that over here. Then I'm going to pick up the Quin Magenta in a medium consistency and do that down here. Then I'll pick up the Quinacridone Purple. Just do that there. Let me take some of that down into this darkest area down here. Then I'm just going to do a bit of lifting. Then I'll do this side, which is a lot lighter than the piece I've just done because it's not in as much shadow. I'm going to take the water right up to the edge on the whole shape. Alright, I'll start with the Quinacridone Rose up at the top. I just want that in a little bit of a thicker consistency. I don't know why I'm getting brownish in there. I don't know if it's at a point where I'm rinsing my brush on in my bowl. There's some green left or something. Alright, let me just spread that around. Then I'll pick up the Quin Magenta. And maybe some Quin Purple in a very light consistency, just to get some purple in here. But now I think that this all is a bit intense, so I'm just going to do some lifting up at the top. I'm going to leave the contrast down here, but up here I'm just going to do some lifting. All right, now I'm going to do some of the green on the remainder of the stalk. And then I'm going to just taper it to be really watery down at the bottom here. And I'll let that dry. Now we're getting to the more detailed central areas of each of the orchids. So I just need to get my base layer down in each of those. For this one over here, I'm going to do this bottom lip section. Although there's little pieces that stick up, I'm going to put water on the whole bottom layer and just do the lighter color first. Likewise, there's little fold over pieces here and these pieces that stick up. So I'm going to put water over the whole area and then distinguish between the lighter and darker areas in an additional layer. Alright, I'm going to start with the Quinacridone Rose on the outside here. And then down here at the bottom. Then I'm going to go to Quin Magenta. And then I'm going to lift some color just on the edge here because it's almost white at the edge. So I've just rinsed off my brush there and I'm going to lift some color here. And then I'm just separating out that little piece that is sticking up and lifting some color there. I'm going to do the same for this piece down here. Alright, I'm picking up the Quin Rose. Oh, I've got quite a lot of water, as you can see it's blooming. And then Quin Magenta. And then I don't think it's necessary to lift the pieces that are standing up because they are in shadow. Alright, I'm going to let that dry. Right, what I'm going to do now is do some of my pink colour in the buds up at the top. So let me work with them one at a time. What I'm going to do is that green highlight area in that top one, I'm not going to put water down on it. I'm going to go around it and drop my pink around the rest of the bud. Alright, I'll take the Quinacridone Rose first. Then I'll take the Quinacridone Magenta. And then the Quinacridone Purple. Alright, let me blend those a bit and lift areas that I want to lighten. I'm just rinsing off my brush, and I just want to lighten down this line on the bottom here. That's where there's a bit more green showing up. I'm going to let that dry a little bit, and then I might come and blend into the highlight area, but it's too wet at the moment. The whole thing will just fill that highlight area if I come and try and blend now. So I'm going to move on to this next bud. Starting with the Quin Rose. and then the Quin Magenta. I've got quite a lot of pooling because there was quite a lot of water that I put down first. I'm just trying to lift some of it. And then I'm going to pick up the Carbazole Violet in a slightly thicker consistency, just so that it doesn't blend so far. I'm going to try and lift in this highlight area. And then just blend down here. Alright, let's do this little bud up at the top. Again, I'm going to paint around the highlight. Okay, the Quinacridone Rose. Quin Magenta. And then the Quin Purple. Alright, so I've rinsed off my brush. Let me just blend this bottom area a little. Alright, so I'm going to go and back to this first one. Don't use a wet brush because it'll cause pooling. I've rinsed and dried off my brush a bit. And I'm just going to try and soften the edges here. And I'll do the same down here. Alright, let me do this bud. I'm going to put water over the whole bud. Although there's a highlight area in this area, it's not quite as bright as the others. I'm just going to do some lifting there. Starting with the Quin Rose. Then the Quin Magenta. You can see I'm purposefully not dropping colour into that area where there's the green highlight. Alright, then the Quin Purple. Then let me blend and lift. Alright, on this bud here, I'm going to work on this area first. You can see that it's mostly white with a little bit of very soft blending. So I'm going to put some water down into this central area first. I'm just going to go up to the edges of where I've worked so far. Then I think I'm going to go straight to Quinacridone Magenta. It's quite wet, it's going to blend quite a lot. I think maybe what I'll do is work with the two similar areas simultaneously on the two buds, just to give that water a little bit of a chance to settle. So in this one I'm also going to put water down in the same area. Alright, now I'm taking my Quin Magenta . And then I'm going to take just the slightest bit of Naples yellow and just put it on the point. And now I'm going to do some lifting to see if I can get those lines. It's quite a staining colour, so it is quite difficult to lift, I find, but I'll do the best I can just to get a bit of contrast between some light and dark on this section. Alright, I'm going to let that all dry. Right, the last thing I'm going to do to get this base layer complete now is I'm going to use Naples yellow as the base color in those areas of the orchid where the spots are. So I'm just going to mix up a very weak consistency mix of the Naples yellow. And because the areas are not very big, I'm not going to work wet and wet. I'm just going to put my watered down pigment straight down And I'm not going to worry too much about the shadow areas or anything at this point. I'm just going to get that color down that I can then work on later. So if I've got to add a bit more water, I'll do that. But this is just straight watered down Naples yellow. I'm just lifting up. There's a bit too much water in that area there. I'll take it down to here. All right, let me see if there's any areas that I want to drop in a little bit of a thicker consistency of Naples yellow, just so that I hopefully don't have to pick it up again. So maybe I'll put some here. Just over there. All right, I think I'm happy with that. I'm going to let this dry completely, and that is our time-consuming but worthwhile base layer complete. Before we start the next layer, I just want to work on my shadow color a little bit more. I was just feeling that the Quinacridone purple was a little bit too in contrast to the other two colors that I was working with. I think it's a little bit too purple for what I'm wanting as far as the shadow color is concerned. So what I'm going to do is, the other two colors are fine for this layer. This is the Quinacridone purple, but I'm going to knock the purple a little bit out of it by adding a bit of the Quinacridone magenta to it. That was the Quinacridone purple on its own. Now that I've added the Quin magenta to it, we can see it's not quite as blue, and I think that that is a good contrast shadow color to this one here, rather than the pure purple. So I'm just mixing up a little bit more of each of the three colors. This is the Quinacridone Rose, and the Quin magenta. And in this layer, we're going to go a little bit more intense in the contrast areas of each petal, so not quite as watery as the first layer. So when I talk about my shadow color, this is the one that I'm going to be referring to, and then I'll refer to the other two as I have in the first layer. So in this layer, we don't want to undo all of the intricate and light work that we did in the first layer, but we're wanting to add some contrast. In that, we want to add our shadow areas, and also I'm going to put in some of the veined lines on each of the petals, but we're definitely not looking at putting color over everywhere all over again, otherwise the first layer would have been unnecessary. So we're going to work petal by petal. It's not nearly as detailed or as stressful, I think, as the first layer. Now that that is all done, now we're just adding all the nice and pretty parts to each petal. But I'm still going to work one petal at a time, and I'm going to work wet and wet. So I'm going to put water down on one petal at a time, almost in, I think, pretty much the same order as we did the first layer. It doesn't need to be as wet as the first layer because we definitely don't want the color to spread as liberally as it did in the first layer. So don't have your water pooling, just have the petal be dampish. So the water must really just be glistening on the surface but not be pooling. And if it is, you can take your brush and you can just dab it off on a paper towel and lift up any excess water on the petal. But do make sure you go right to the edge, otherwise you will get another line where the water layer ends on the second layer. Alright, so let me have a look at the sketch. I'm going to pick up some Quinacridone Magenta, and I can see that we can probably do with a bit more here and there. It's spreading a bit too much at the stage for me to come and do the shadow down the sides here. I'm just going to let it dry a bit and pick up some color along the edge. Alright, now I'm going to pick up some of the shadow color just on the tip of my brush. Don't pick up too much, otherwise it's going to drop too much paint on your paper. Start down at the bottom here in case it spreads too much. And I'm just using the very tip of my brush to put that shadow color down where the one petal is over the other. And although you can't really see it on the photograph, I'm going to take artistic license and do it over here as well. And now I'm going to rinse off my brush and just push that back so that it doesn't spread too far. Then I'm going to pick up Quinacridone Magenta. I'm drying off my brush, just taking a little bit of water on the tip and a little bit of the Quin Magenta on the tip of my brush again, not too much. And here's where you're just going to have to play around a bit. I want to put the veins down, but when I put the lines down, I don't want the color to spread everywhere. So it's got to be damp, but not dry, just so that you do get a little bit of spreading, but not too much. So that's where you're going to have to play around a bit. If you want to do a practice petal or two on a separate sheet of paper to see how you've got to time it for your lines, then do that. I can see that my paper is on its way to drying. I'm just going to take the last hair of my brush and just touch it to the paper. You can see that's the perfect amount of blooming or spreading, where it isn't going all over the page, but there's a slight bit as I put it down, very, very lightly. I'm just going to pick up a little bit more of the Quin Magenta. It's a bit heavy-handed. I don't want to overdo it. I'm happy with that. I'd rather come back and do more once it's dry than do too much. Alright, I'm going to put some water down in this top petal now. I'm going to pick up some Quinacridone Magenta. And then I'm going to water down a little bit of my shadow color and just drop it in down here. I can see this layer is quite wet. You can see that by the amount that it is spreading. So I wouldn't want to be putting any veins down now or anything like that. I'm just going to push back just so that I reserve some of that lightness from the first layer. Alright, I'm not going to do anything more in there right now. It's too wet. I'm going to put some water down in this petal. I'm just lifting the excess. Alright, let me take some Quinacridone Magenta. And then my shadow color watered down. I'm just seeing, you can see where I had put my water down, but I didn't match the two layers to each other. So I'm going to get a separate line if I don't blend them to match each other. So whenever you're doing an additional glaze layer, just check that your two layers of water that you've put down match each other. Otherwise you'll get a line inside your boundary. Right, I think let me try and do some veins on this. I am watering down my shadow color a little bit, and I've put some on my brush, but I'm tapping it off just so that it's not too heavily loaded. Let's see. You see it's still far too wet. Look how much it's blooming. I'm just going to wait half a minute. I think it'll be drier up at the top more so than down here, so I'm going to try from the top down. And I think that's enough for that one. I'm just going to lift a little. All right, let's do this one. So I'm really not, I've watered down my shadow color quite a lot because I don't want it to be too much darker than what is already there. Yes, I want contrast, but I don't want it to jump out at me. And if it's too intense, I can just lift it with my paper towel. Alright, so that's the first one done. It's going to be quite repetitive, so I think I'm going to let some music play, and I will just put on the screen what color I'm using each time, but we're going to basically rinse and repeat that for the remaining two blooms. My apologies, I'm really frustrated that my camera stopped recording whilst I was doing the remainder of these 3 buds that are here. So just to explain what I did there, and I'm going to do exactly the same thing on this one down here, was that if I see in the photograph there is a light ridge where the overlap occurs on each bud. So I'm trying to do the same thing in the layer that I'm doing now. So when I put my water layer down on this bud here, I'm going to leave about a 2mm gap, and I'm also going to not put water down on this highlight area here and rather blend it in after I've put my colors down. So as I put the water down on this bud here, just work around the lighter area and leave about a 2mm gap down the join. I'm just picking up any excess water so that it's not pooling on the surface. I'm picking up the Quin Magenta. And the shadow color. And then I'm just going to rinse and dry off my brush, lift anything that's a little bit too intense in color, and then blend the colors together. And then I'm just going to push this a little bit closer to the edge, just so that the gap is about 1mm. I'm just lifting where it's lighter. And then with my brush almost dry, I'm just going to soften this area around the highlight. And now you'll be able to go back and repeat the same thing on these 3. So these 2 had a highlight in pretty much the same place. This one had a Y-shaped highlight, which I left out the middle. I'm going to do a second layer on the stalk now. And if you have a look at the photograph, there are different colors present on the stalk. The area that is older here and the main stalk have got a bit of purple in the green, and then the stalks that have got the flowers and the buds on are a lighter shade of green, and I'm going to carry that through into my sketch now. I've already got a line here separating this young stalk. That one is also separate. But what I want to do is just over here, we can see where the stalk comes off the main branch. I'm just going to mark that off for myself there. And then here I'm going to do a little bit across and then just come down a bit like that for that piece. And then up here, maybe like that. And then I'm going to prepare my colors for the stalk. So I did it before where I had the sap green. I'm going to prepare 2 areas. I'm just moving this out the way so I don't splash any paint on there just for now. I'm going to put sap green in both of these wells. Now I used burnt umber to just knock the green back in the first layer. I'll do that again. I think it's going to need a bit more. Just putting a bit of sap green back into that. Alright, I'm happy with that. Then for this darker one, I mean, I could put just more sap green in it, but in an effort to try and keep coherency amongst my colors, I'm going to add some quin magenta to that. It's a little bit brown. Let me just put some green back into that. Now it's too green. More quin magenta. Right, we'll see how we go with that. Alright, so I'm going to, I think, work with the darker sectioned area just in this top part here. I'll come down and do the other one in a bit. So I'm using the lines that I've made to be the where I'm going to put my water up to. So the left side of the stalk is the lighter side. The sun is coming from the left in this photograph. So I'm going to get the lighter green mix first. Just drop that down the right. And over here, I'll just put it under. And here on the right. It's just a bit too much water there. Let me just lift. I don't want the color spreading across the whole little twig. Alright, so before I come in with the darker color, I'm just rinsing off my brush and just lifting off the areas that are lighter. Then I'm going to pick up the darker color and drop that down the right. It's quite intense, but it's fine. I mean, the branch is quite dark. Picking up that same color, I'm going to come along the bottom here. Let's define that area there, and then go along the bottom here. Then I'm just rinsing off my brush and encouraging some blending. And then whilst that's still damp, I'm going to pick up the darker green again. And just on the tip of my brush, it'll blend less now that it's drying. I just want to exaggerate that shadow on this side. And also just define this section that's coming out. And then let's just blend. And then I've kind of forgotten this little piece down here. I'm just going to put some more water, just dampen it again. Alright, I'm going to go and do exactly the same thing on these two sections of stalk down here. I'll let some music play whilst I do that. let's put some shadowing on the smaller stalks now. Because these are so narrow, I'm actually going to work wet on dry so that the color that I did put down doesn't blend the whole way across. So let's do the bigger one first, because that's easier than doing the really narrow ones. I'm just rinsing off my brush, and I'm going to put that green color that we mixed on my brush, just a little bit on the tip of my brush. And I'm going to put that on the right. Then I'm going to rinse off my brush and encourage some blending with a damp brush. Then I'm going to do the same down the left hand side, just not quite as much because the right hand side is the shadow side. Maybe I'm going to water that green down just a little bit so it's not quite so intense. There, it's touching where I've blended across. That's not too bad. I can lift it if I need to. So let me just do some blending here. Then I'm going to rinse off my brush, dry it, and then just lift through the center area. And maybe I'll just take a bit of that green and define this join. And a bit more up the shadow side. Or I'm just picking up the green color and putting it down the right hand side. And then let me blend. And likewise, I'll do the bottom as well. For the top one, I'm just picking up the green. It's really, really small twigs, so we don't want to do too much here. Picking up that green again, I'm going to come and do this one. And then this one's got a bit of a bend in the stalk. You can see I've put a little bit of a line here. I'm just going to extend that a bit for myself. If we do our shadow right there, we'll be able to indicate that bend in the stalk. So what I'm going to do is pick up the green and start in here. Then I'll get water. And what I'm actually going to do is pick up that darker greeny purple shadow color and just drop this tiniest bit in there. And then just put some green across the top here. And at the bottom. And then there's that tiny little bit at the top here. I'm just going to, I could have left it out entirely, but I'll just do that. I'm just picking up that green and putting a bit more here. And then I think I'm going to let that dry now. Right, now I want to do some work on the inner sections of the orchids, as well as the sort of tongue that it comes out the bottom. So I'm going to start by doing a shadow on the underside here. So I'm going to do the shadow first and then the spots in an additional layer. So I just want to push this back by putting it in shadow. And I don't want too dark a shadow. I'm also just lifting some water so that my shadow doesn't spread too far. And I'm going to pick up some Quinacridone Magenta. I'm going to drop it in here where the shadow would be the darkest, and then I'm going to spread it. So let me just rinse off my brush. I'm just going to add a little bit more. Just so that I can spread it all the way here. Right, then this tongue area has got a fold over. There is a side here that is folded over. So, and then it goes lighter here. And then also the part that folds over here, these little bits are lighter than the shadow that we're going to put down. So now we need to be a little bit careful with the water that we're putting down. I want to avoid this fold over as well as the little ribbon pieces. going to pick up my Quinacridone Magenta in a thickish consistency because it really is quite dark underneath there. I've got quite a lot on my brush. I'm just tapping a little bit of it off. And then I'm going to tap it in here. I want it to get lighter as I get to the edge here. So along the edge of the fold over, I'm going to do it dark. Then I'm going to pick up the Quinacridone Rose in a thickish consistency, just so that I can change it to a brighter pink. I'm just avoiding the frilly tendrils as I go. I've just rinsed off my brush a little bit because I'm sure I've still got pigment on my brush here. And I'm essentially just pushing it back from here. Right, is there anything I need to clean up here? I'm just going to push this to the edge. Clean up over there. Alright, I'm happy with that. Let's go down and do the same thing with the one below. Alright, so we've got these two little sort of wings that stick up here. The ones behind them are in shadow. So I'm going to put water down here and then around those two that stand up on their own. Right, I'm just picking up my Quinacridone Magenta. And then I'm just going to help that spread. I don't know quite what I've done here. I think I have painted over the second one. I can't quite see my pencil work. I'm just going to do that and figure it out later. And then I want to go straight into working on this one below, so I'm just going to put a hairdryer on that section above so that I can continue working below. Right, that's dry now, and I also just put a little bit of pencil in to try and figure out what's going on here. It's a little bit off-center and not entirely correct, but it's just going to have to do for now. So let's go down to this section here. I can see on the photograph that the little tendrils are actually darker than the petal itself, but I'm still going to try and work around them just so that I can work with them separately. You could paint over them entirely if you wished, but I'm just going to work with them separate. So I'm going to put water around the tendrils on the bottom lip here. There's also this little tongue of yellow, but I'm actually just going to ignore it and take a bit of artistic license there. All right, picking up the Quinacridone Magenta. It's not quite as dark as the one above, but I'm going to just put some shadow at the base here nonetheless and work it forward. I'll also take some Quinacridone Rose and just dot that around the edge. All right, let's blend and smooth this out. All right, then I think we're going to let this dry and completely, and then come back and do the spots. Right, I'm going to work on the spots now, and I think to mix up a color, I'm going to work with Quinacridone Magenta. But in a thickish consistency, but I also just want to darken it a bit. So what shall I add? Maybe I'm going to add a little bit of the sap green. Let me add a little bit more. That makes a nice deep contrast color. Alright, so I don't want my brush too heavily loaded. So let's see. Let's start on this one here. I'm just using the photograph as a guide as to the sort of direction that they're lying in. So for example, on the inside here, there's a bit of a curve like this. So I'll start with the top row. And then they kind of disappear to us. But then I don't want to do it too sort of regular and brickwork like, so vary the size of them. Right, that's enough for there. Here I'll just do little small ones. Right here they come around the outside, so I'll pick it up here. And then here, it kind of goes up, down, and up again. And then in here, it's really quite random, isn't it, if you have a look at the photograph? But I'll just keep with the idea that there was sort of some uniformity to the direction of the spots. All right, let's do the bottom one. So the bottom one, there's a wing that comes here. What direction? I can't even really see. I think it's like that. And then these guys, little ones across the top, maybe smaller like that. And then the ones inside here are a little bit more difficult to see. I think that's good enough. All right, let's go to these tendrils now and see what we can do with them. All right, so I'm going to start with these ones. If I have a look at the photograph, we're just wanting to get a bit of shadow on one side and the other. So let me pick up, what color? I'm going to pick up that shadow color. And I'm going to mix it a bit with Quinacridone Magenta. I'm going to come down on the left of the side, wet on dry. And on the right here. Then I'm going to rinse off my brush and do a bit of blending. I'm going to try and leave the right hand side the lightest, just so that it is contrast against the flower below. Likewise here, I'm just going to try and leave the left millimeter unpainted. Alright, picking up that same shadow color mixed with the Quinacridone Magenta. Let's do the right one. So we've got... I'm going to go down the right hand side, then down the left because there's a twist in it, and then just define it up there. And then I'm just going to get some quinacridone purple on its own in a thickish consistency, but not heavily loading my brush. And I'm just going to do that down the right there. Just to define the edges. Right, let's do the one at the bottom. Okay, picking up the shadow Quinacridone Magenta mix. Let's do the right hand side of this tendril. And then I'll come underneath there. And on this one, I will define the right. All right, let's let that dry and decide if we want to do anything else. Or maybe before I let it dry, I didn't do the quinacridone purple on that. So on those tendrils there, let's just do that just to define them more. So my quinacridone purple, I'm just touching along the edge here. Just to separate these tendrils from the flower. And then I'm just going to smooth that a little. Right, now I'm going to let it dry and then we'll see from there. I think that we're very nearly almost there. I think the only thing I want to do in this layer is to add some additional veins to the flowers. So I'm going to start up at the top here with the little buds. And for that, I think I'm going to actually use, in my palette here, I've got that darker color that we mixed up in the previous layer. I'm going to mix that with some of the carbazole violet, but just keep in mind that for this layer I want to work really watery. I don't want those veins to stick out unnaturally, so it's really is about 90% water. I just want to practice my lines a bit here. And they will dry lighter because of the amount of water that I've got going. I'd rather come back and do them a second time than have them turn out too dark. So, and also there, I've used my brush too heavily and my line was too thick. So I really just want to use the last hair on my brush. You can use a rigger brush as well if you want to, because they make the lines thinner. I'm just going to work really carefully and with my color really watered down and see how I go. I'm just going to turn my page so that I can work at an angle that is comfortable for my hand. So let's work from left to right. I'll do this one first. Actually, let's do this one and then I'll do these from left to right so that my hand doesn't touch anything that I'm working with. So I've got the color on my brush, I'm just tapping it off. And I'm just going to use a feather touch with the brush for these lines. I'm going to skip out the highlight and carry on below. It's a little bit thick up there. Where that lighter edge is over there, I'm kind of a bit over it with that first one. I want to just preserve that light edge and not take my lines over that. Right, that's good enough there. If anything, the lines on this bud are even lighter than the first one, so I'm trying to use my brush even lighter than I did for the first. I'm going to skip the highlight again on this one. Right, then I'm happy with the number of veins and lines I've got on this top one here. I'm not going to add anything to that. So let's take this one here. I'm going to use Quinacridone Magenta, also extremely watered down. I'm also going to turn the page to what is comfortable for me. So I'm going to work on this one first. I just want to add a few little extras to what is already here. I can see already that that's too dark. I'm watering it down more. I don't know why it's so watery in my palette. So I'm just going to work around and put my line down first and then use my tissue paper to lift most of it, just so that there is the lightest vein left for each line that I put down. This painting is so delicate and I don't want the veins that I put down to stand out in stark contrast to all of the delicate work that I've put in the layers below. Alright, that's enough there. Whilst I've got my page at this angle, I'll work at this one with this one on the right hand side. Being right-handed, one always wants to do the line and then pull to the right, so that's why that one is difficult. Alright, let's do this bottom one here. I will do these few to the right. Alright, so I think that those will dry quite a bit lighter. I'm just trying to think if I want to. I haven't done any in the central one here. Not that I can see any in the photograph itself, and that's probably the reason why. But I think it just makes sense to do a couple. So let's just do that. All right. Okay, let's let that dry and see what else we want to add. Now that that is dry, I'm very happy with the way that it's looking now, and I'm happy to call it a day at this point. You are welcome to carry on and compare this to your painting to the reference photo and see if there's anything else you want to tweak or change. But for me, I'm happy to call it a day.